Welcome to our last session, studying the logic of faith. And once again, just an apology for the mix-up with the registration link, where I had to send it out last minute. I had to create the webinar. I had to create a new webinar because I had actually used up the booked 6 Thursdays due to this one time where I canceled. Anyway, here we are, and I've been very encouraged getting some very positive feedback from some of you who've been reading this, so I'm very happy. This seems to be making sense. So this is a pleasure then to present this, and I'll see how far I get. Like I've been saying, I wanted to line this up with some of the classical ways that the Praticca Samutpada gets taught. So we'll see how we go for time. So first of all, the homage. I pledge allegiance to the experience of grace, the expression of human insight, from which all authentic faith traditions have arisen. I pledge allegiance to Mother Emptiness, Prajna Paramita, to the wisdom of the Buddha, and to the great spiritual genius Nagarjuna. First and foremost, I pledge allegiance to my beloved teacher, Ziga Kongtrul Rinpoche. So this is Elizabeth Mattis Namgyel's homage. Now, so far, we've covered introducing the fact that nothing exists without causes and conditions, and hence does not have any intrinsic nature. And that's what we very often refer to as emptiness, that things don't possess intrinsic nature. It doesn't mean that things aren't there, but it's that we cannot say that they have a solid identity. That we sometimes use in the classical language, you say they don't exist as established from their own side. Or we say they don't have inherent existence. Everything exists on the basis of what Elizabeth called leaning. But this is the introduction to this nature, Praticca Samutpada, this dependently arisen quality of all phenomena. And the mind that realizes this goes beyond the ordinary limitations of the mind that is about asserting this is, this isn't, and simply allows that things, yes, they are and they also aren't. They manifest, yet their nature is empty. And the mind that realizes this is then no longer caught up in the ordinary games or the ordinary patterns of the mind that asserts existence and non-existence. And hence the mind is freed from its habitual yet unnecessary limitation. And it's this freeing that gives way to this greater dimension of grace, where the way we interact is through a dimension of awe and also a dimension of freedom, joy, insight, and so forth. All these wonderful qualities that we could refer to as grace. And so we have the wisdom traditions then of grace, and that's what we're going to be talking about today in the way that we engage with this. So this chapter is called Living Tradition. This is, of course, this is not something that's, again, by the very nature of not existing in terms of the way that we ordinarily objectify things. It doesn't exist as a tradition of data, information, but rather a tradition of experience, of liberation, and so forth. So to apprentice and to learn this, we engage in a community of the living rather than books. And that's why we speak about then tradition, we talk about lineage, we talk about schools, and so forth. And this is because we're part of a heritage that come down to us, which is about theory partly, but also then about experience, realization. So the section here is called Customized Spirituality. And Ziga Rinpoche, he says, to help you on the path, you have maps left by the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, teachers, and lineage masters of the past. What did they encounter on their journey? What did or did not work for them? Due to their kindness, you have this incredible information to use and enjoy. So this is in Rinpoche's work called It's Up to You. So this is where we have the heritage, and we very often look at the lives of masters of the past, and I think it's important that we bypass this sort of sense that, oh yeah, they lived in a different culture. It's rather about that they owned up to their existing challenges and journeyed beyond their limitations. And these limitations, they're universal. They're essentially about our insecurity, the afflicted mind, and so forth. This is universal everywhere. Likes and dislikes, all the various styles of conflicting emotions, kleshas, and so forth. So there's a lot of territory that's been covered. There's a lot of maps that exist. Now, in terms of the practices that we encounter then in these various traditions, very often the modern person will say, well, that's kind of not for me. That's the way they do it. And there's this sort of parochial fear of the other, that, oh yeah, the Tibetans, they do it this way, and so forth. And I think it's not so much about really the doing and the praxis, and that very often is unfortunately what people they look at. But the modern person particularly has this hang-up about tradition. I grew up in a culture where the greatest thing you could do was something that was not traditional, that you broke with tradition, that you had this sort of not even rebellion. It was more like, oh yeah, religions or no traditions. They're defunct. They're irrelevant to us, the modern person, right? But if we look in all the various cultures, we have forms of rituals in all of them. And when we look, these rituals have been very effective. And many of these rituals have actually, due to having been proven effective, they've been preserved with great care. We might think that some of the practices we have are like just normal, or we might think that they're justified by some sort of, like we might say, our science. We might say the way that we modern people do things, that's like an enlightened way of doing things, and so forth. But they equally all, in fact, rituals. Things can be done in so many different ways. And somebody coming in from another planet, they might look at the ways that we have our, let's say, our institutions of learning. And they will say, oh, isn't it interesting? They like to go into rooms, and they like to look at blackboards, or they like to wear white coats. They like to put things on their noses that in front of their eyes, and so on. So of course, all of these have purposes, but coming from the outside, we might just think that they're just practices that might not be relevant. Anyway, the point here is then the Buddhist tradition, we have practices, and in this sense, we have two transmissions of Buddhism. There's the realization, which is, of course, what we are interested in here, which is the actual experience of awakening. And then we have what we could refer to as the ritual, the theory, and so forth, which is generally known as scripture. So we have what's called Tokpa. I think it's Abhisamaya, which is the experience. And then we have the agrama or the lung, which is the transmission of theory and practice. Now, as far as the Buddhist teaching goes, the practice spans a lot of, you could say, right from, you could say, like, for example, Vajrayana ritual, very intricate, but also in Theravadan traditions, there's a lot of ritual as well, reading the scriptures, doing things in particular ways that have been the ways they've been done since a very long time. And then you also have the complete absence of any form, really, and yet that is also part of a culture of no form, if you like, the language, form, or rather teaching without language. And Elizabeth refers to the Heart Sutra, where in there the Buddha is teaching, yet he's not really teaching. It says he goes into a samadhi called profound illumination. All of this, by the way, happened at this place called Vulture's Peak, which is not that far from Bodh Gaya. It's still in Bihar in India. It's a couple of hours drive from Bodh Gaya. It's not so far from Nalanda, I seem to remember. Anyway, you can go there to this day. There's a big Japanese stupa there. It's called Rajgir. And anyway, here at Vulture's Peak is where then this teaching called the Heart Sutra took place, where the Buddha just sat quietly, but due to the atmosphere that the Buddha created, and then a dialogue took place between Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara. And at the end, the Buddha simply said, having listened to Avalokiteshvara explain something to Shariputra on the basis of Shariputra's inquiry, then the Buddha said, well spoken, well spoken. So it is, so it is. And so this is another way of communicating. Now, in the process where we practice the path, then of course there's a place where we begin to appreciate then this sacred quality of the journey that we're undertaking and the methods, where all of a sudden the words and the practices, they begin to take on a particular role, a sacred quality. So this naturally happens, and we have as a result then in the various, not just in the Buddhist traditions, but we have this all over. In spiritual traditions, yes, a number of sacred rituals. But it's interesting that in ordinary life, we also have rituals which are sometimes even, well, they attain importance, like handshake. You know, let's say somebody doesn't want to shake your hand. That's significant, right? Shaking hand can be very important. The way we comport ourselves at parties, we dress up in particular ways, we participate in the going-ons in particular ways. In America, the children, I've done this myself. I went to an American school as a kid, and I remember we had to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and for which it stands and so forth. So there's that. There's cheering, there's this sort of applauding that we do. We have lots of rituals. You know, imagine that somebody performs and there's no applause and so forth. So everywhere we have this practice of ritual. It's natural to our interaction, social interaction, and it's also natural to the way that we, particularly then on the path, engage. It becomes what we call skillful means. So referring then again to the Heart Sutra, in there the Buddha reminds us that the illusory tools of language and communication do not function as truths, but rather as means that open us to grace. And so just like shaking hands is not about that you really want to hold somebody's hand necessarily. It's a gesture of welcoming somebody into your space, being willing to engage with another person, and so forth. So in this way, the ritual is something that stands for something beyond itself. Now, when this does, and particularly then when we're here talking about spiritual traditions, Then, as we've seen in religions and so forth, then we have, all of a sudden we have should, shouldn't. These should and shouldn'ts, they creep in, and that's where, you have this, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. And this is where the rituals and the forms, they begin to feel rigid and impersonal. So this is where then spiritual communities that initially were based on genuine insight, if this insight and this transmission of what we could call the transmission of realization is lost, then it becomes empty form, it becomes organized religion. And then we have simply what then Elizabeth refers to this theoretical physicist, David Peat, who then speaks about closed system, or rather spirituality becomes a closed system, and then she refers to Peat's term limit cycles, which implies how communities, people, and so forth, they cling to notions of right, what has to be done. That's normal. And if we break away from that, that's incomprehensible. So with that, we have practices, physical things that we do. We have certain ideas that we subscribe to, and so forth. So this happens in in collective beliefs, organized religion. We also have this then within family patterns, where there might be a particular narrative that's happening in a pattern about people and the way they interact with each other. There's a standard way that we see each other. We also see this with friends, or in social communities of all kinds. Then we also have ways that we think about ourselves and beliefs that we have about ourselves. And of course, we have assumptions that exist throughout our culture, narratives and discourse, what we sometimes call discursive hegemonies, where a culture is controlled by particular assumptions, and they might not even be that well established. Some of the scientific assumptions or some of the narratives around the science that we have in our world is very much based on just a held belief system. And the ways that we see history, the way that we construct narratives around history and so forth. So there's many different ways in which this exists, and these are all then these kind of these styles of cycles that we become familiar with. And the more we get held by that, the more fragile in some way we are, because they're always changing. Elizabeth makes the point about how animals, the more we the more we accommodate change, the more resilience we have. And she draws this from also the animal world, where animals who have changing habitats, they are more resilient. So the fact is that conditions are always changing, and that's of course what's implicit in this whole text, that nothing is unchanging. She also makes a point which I think is important. She talks about the phenomenon of rejecting. Then, as a result, then sometimes we reject particular cultures, but then again, this rejection becomes in a way just a pattern. Like a lot of I've seen in my generation, which emerged from the '68 generation of rebellion, from the post-Second World War idea of rebellion. And then they find their own culture, these people who rebel, but then because they have habituated to rebelling, then they continually undermine their own foundation, and which we'll be looking at also later, this sort of myth of exit freedom, that there's always some skipping around and not really settling with something. So that's where, for example, the call for American Buddhism is the idea of, we reject this sort of the traditional ways that these natives in Tibet, they've done things, or these natives in these, you know, third world countries that are not privy to our enlightened perspective, that they do things, and we're going to reinvent it, and we're going to reject their sort of inferior understanding of the world, and we're going to update. We're going to update Buddhism. So there's a strong belief system there that also sort of prompts this sort of rejection of well, it's not sort of, you know, not even, it becomes a cycle in itself. This wishing to be modern, wishing to reinvent. Now, did I just skip something here? Oh yeah, I did. Oh yeah, I'm really getting ahead of myself here. Okay. Anyway, there's a yeah, this little rap about the rejecting traditionalism was also had to do with this one here. Anyway, look, the teaching itself, and this is also what we see in the huts. Well, this is what the point was before. Gestures point to what is beyond them, and so even the teaching itself, like Dharmakirti, he says, when we accomplish the teaching, it being just like a vessel, a boat, or something that transports us across the water, then when we get to the other side, well, we don't drag the boat with us, we leave it there. And so likewise, also the teaching itself is merely something that is provisional. It's something that facilitates a journey. It's not something that's ultimate, but it has a role in terms of getting us somewhere. So Thich Nhat Hanh, he points to how even the teaching is provisional. And I remember my friends telling me about Kyabje Dundrum Rinpoche, who was teaching in New York in the late 1970s, who also made a point about the tradition. Yes, it seems to be very sacred, but at the same time, it's still relative truth. It's still provisional truth. So it's not absolute. So we're not, when we say this is not that we're rejecting traditional practice when we say that when we say, oh, the tradition isn't absolute and so forth. It's more really to understand what is the nature of the practice, of the ritual, of the various forms and so forth. So then we understand what they're doing. So it's when we don't understand then that this leads to rejecting it. And that is where sometimes people, they look at some of the practices of Buddhism and they just see it in terms of the practice, and they don't understand how the practice is really just facilitating an objective, which is the absolute, the wisdom, the insight that leads to grace and so forth. And it's then when there's that kind of lack of understanding, then there's some sort of notion that, oh yeah, these practices, they need to be changed and so forth. Well, you know, they of course, the practices are relative, but you know, it's again, if we understand their nature, then so often we are not about the practice itself, but with the understanding of what they lead to, we kind of say, oh, that is quite helpful, you know, like for example, sitting in meditation posture. You might think, oh, that's a really Asian thing to do. We don't need to do that. If you look at some of the mindfulness trends we have nowadays, they don't particularly emphasize the meditation. But anybody who really practices mindfulness will see that actually meditation is helpful. Sitting in meditation posture has a great value. So that's where we needn't reject that. Okay. The the problem with customized spirituality is that the problem with customized spirituality is that it often is based on feeling good. So when we are skipping around, then very often without the ultimate insight of what the spiritual path is about, we might not really understand the nature of these methods, and hence what drives us to develop new methods is really just what we feel good with. Well, and so the ultimate objective of some of the practices are missed. So the premise of this kind of customized spiritual approach is that it's not having understood the tradition in the first place. Rejection of one tradition is just another limit cycle. So again, coming back to this wish to just constantly have to rebel and update and so forth. The myth of exit freedom makes transformation difficult. Because the moment that we think that we're sort of going for something better, then we're just looking at something external and not actually dealing with the one who's who's undertaking this journey. Elizabeth says transformation cannot take place if you jump from one thing to another, because, as it turns out, there's nothing you can ever engage that always brings contentment and comfort. To understand this is to dispel the myth of exit freedom, the assumption that it is the world outside that binds you, that liberation comes from fleeing whenever the going gets rough. So this is a very familiar pattern, and it is with just not sticking with the remedial, practice until it actually works. But I'm not seeing any results right now. I want something else. That's a problem. The role of the teacher is to make the student independent, autonomous. But to become independent, we need guidance. We humbly need to recognize our indebtedness to others. We live in grace in humble recognition of the lineage. Such life empowers a path of inquiry and spiritual clarity. This is not a pitch for or against organized religion, but about the middle way beyond belief and doubt. So the teacher is there to enable the student to have insight. It would be a sad teacher who wished to gather students to make money, to make a career, to become famous, to become, what we would call conventionally successful, have a flourishing empire. That would be a sad teacher. The enlightened teacher doesn't suffer from this kind of insecurity and is there exclusively out of compassion, wishing to enable others to experience the liberation, the joy, the freedom, and so forth. So the genuine teacher couldn't care the slightest about what we call the 8 worldly dharmas, which is praise, blame, gain, loss, all these things of hope and fear. Genuine teacher doesn't have that. But the genuine teacher is very, very present in the life of the students, wishing to enable the student to become someone who experiences the same and basically become free, autonomous. And Elizabeth gives the example of parenting, where, of course, the parent would like the child to become autonomous, independent, confident, and so forth. But the thing is also, just like a child needs the guidance and the love and the non-rejection and so forth of the parent, that the child feels this security, then for that to happen, there has to be somebody else. And that's where when we achieve this is something where we end up, we're actually indebted to somebody. We're indebted to our parents, we're indebted to our teachers. And this is a very healthy place to be. Because yes, we gain autonomy, but also there's a humility. It's not like I did it my way. It's very much, I'm here thanks to others. Much less ego, much less insecurity. And that's where this experience of liberation, living in grace, comes with a humble recognition to those that went before. It's interesting in the Tibetan word for Buddha nature is rik, which means lineage or family, and that has the understanding, as we know, Buddha nature as being something inside, but it also has something to do with those that we are connected with in terms of our lineage. And this is not exclusive lineage. This lineage applies to all sentient beings and all Buddhas. But that is where there's a sense of connectedness and indebtedness, humility. So Elizabeth is not trying to say this because she wants to trying to point about. She doesn't want to make a particular point about religions or rituals or systems and so on, but just beginning to understand the complexity of this issue and actually arriving at that which lies beyond, and that is the middle way. This is about understanding this the value of the what facilitates this arriving at an insight that goes beyond belief and doubt, existing, not existing, for and against. And the beauty of this then is that grace then comes from uniting discernment with openness and humility. And this is also then what has to do with the entire book, really, which is discerning the logic with humility that opens us up to something greater, faith. No questions? Okay, some of the really good feedback I got was that this book is very clear. So my sort of commentary here is sort of just how do you say, bringing home the obvious, or sort of reasserting what's already clear. But that's okay. That's good. That's good. So I'm glad to hear that everybody seems to be confident with what's happening here. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, he says, it is vital for us to obtain genuine confidence in the nature of mind and reality, grounded in understanding and reason. So the objective is this confidence, this realization of mind and the reality that we're living in. That's the objective. But initially we have to have understanding. The thing about understanding, we would say, is that it has this vajra quality of being unrelenting. It doesn't matter if it's a rainy day or a sunny day. If we understand something with reason, it's unchanging, no matter how we feel. 2 + 2, it's 4. Doesn't matter how we feel about it. So that's why we can proceed with the practice with a, you could say, unconditional understanding that drives us, or leads us, or guides us. Yeah. So in this work here, when we talk about logic, it's not about logical systems, but about the logic of our experience. And again, if we look inside, what we're talking about here, it's something that we experience. Pratitya Samutpada is intended to connect insight and enabling openness. So this is the nature of the Buddha teaching. This is not about developing a new philosophy. It's about enabling us to understand something about us in relation to our reality. And it's about us beginning to be sensitive to our reality. Such openness is not about shutting down through labels and concepts. So the Buddha was not about teaching a Buddhism that then became a set of practices and beliefs and labels and concepts. We might sometimes, if we look at it from the outside, purely from the anthropological or structuralist sort of ways of approaching things, that we might define that, oh yeah, that's how the Buddhists, they see things, That's exactly actually what the Buddha wanted to free us from. Elizabeth says, genuine insight and confidence reveal themselves only to the mind that can withstand the brilliance and fathomless nature of interdependence without clinging to definitive notions of is and is not. So the thing is also this insight, of course, it defies this habitual pattern of insecurity that wishes to limit and classify and categorize and pigeonhole reality. So of course, this is where this vision is about something that is not necessarily that easy. So that is where we talk about that this reveals itself then to those that can withstand the brilliance of this nature. Yeah? She says the logic of faith as presented here can be understood in a single statement. Because everything leans, nothing exists in a definitive way. So it follows that the only way to know without error comes with the insight that does not seek determinate truths. And that's again where we, when we begin to sort of see, when we begin to see the nature of reality, we understand that it's not necessarily this way or that way. Joanna Macy, who Elizabeth then has quoted a few times in this work, she says, from the viewpoint of mutual causality, the impossibility of arriving at ultimate definitions and formulations of reality does not represent a defeat for the inquiring mind. It is only final assertions that are suspect, not the process of knowing itself. So us not being able to sort of arrive at ta-ta, this is it, that's not really a problem. In fact, it's more a problem when we begin to have some sort of assertion. Taking the word assertion reminds me of Nagarjuna, who in presenting the middle way actually said, I have no flaw because I have no assertion, I have no flaw. And that's the middle way philosophy of dismantling these conceptual practices of pigeonholing reality. And that is not a problem. That doesn't in any way prevent us knowing. So knowing comes, but it's about the knowing that's not objectifying truths. This, of course, also is a big theme in the modern world, in the modern world in terms of the dismantling of traditions and even the dismantling of what traditionally in Western philosophy was seen as philosophy, as truth and so forth, where philosophers say, yeah, in fact, we can't find anything absolute. And that actually poses a problem. Anyway, I won't go into that here, and I think I have talked about it before. Anyway, what we have used here, where we say because everything leans, nothing exists in a definitive way, that's a logical statement. And yet, what we are doing with this, only attains its value when it's linked to personal experience. So as much as we might be able to expound on this, then it really only has its value when we live it. Such experience becomes understanding and gives conviction and resolution. Again, this knowing is the knowing of not grasping, but it does provide a sense of confidence and conviction and resolution. And Elizabeth then says, it's my hope that you have discovered through the investigations presented in this book that there is no need to abandon logic in order to faith. So we use this insight in order to arrive at that which is beyond the graspable. In fact, Buddhism is founded on a vision of freedom and openness. So this is basic to what we're doing on the path of Dharma. As a path, it employs rationality, but it's not an end in itself. We're not creating philosophers or fundamentalists. And I didn't find the quote here exactly, but I remember just from reading Trolley Kyabgon Rinpoche's book on karma, that he makes a point of actually the Buddha's method. The particular style of the Buddha's teaching was very much about taking philosophical insights, but illustrating them and making them approachable with everyday examples and lining it up with everyday experience. And of course, that is what we're doing. Without experience, all of this is just data, and essentially it's not what it's about. So this, of course, is good news, because we do engage logic, and that's good news for the modern person who's been taught to appreciate evidence over blind faith. We've all been brought up to think critically. And so that's where this approach here is actually unites two camps. We could say the materialist camp with the spiritual camp, or certainly the logical camp or the reason-based camp, which very often doesn't embrace the sense of the infinite, or that which lies beyond language. Elizabeth says, when you take up the task of your own awakening through direct investigation, it gives spirituality traction in the context of your day-to-day life. We cannot expect spiritual transcendence while entrenched in the realm of fixed ideas and vague assumptions. So it's surprising how often we operate with vague assumptions and things that we just say, well, that's just how it is. We don't quite know why, but we are certainly the departure from that is unthinkable. And that's where, of course, we very often have these sort of we're held back by these what's the word, limit cycles. On the path, we're intending to alleviate suffering, right? But what do we mean with this? So if we're going to be practicing the Buddhist teaching, is that going to bring about an end to suffering? Well, what exactly do we mean with this? It's a bit more complex than that everything's going to be cotton candy. So when we look as per interdependence, we cannot avoid suffering in the sense of no more feeling. We obviously have the conditions, if you like, the karma and so forth, for discomfort. But the thing is, how we handle these conditions, that's more what it's about. It's not about having all of a sudden just a smooth ride with no bumps. Elizabeth says, my teacher has often said that the middle way path is not about seeking peace. Seeking peace entails a search for preferred experiences where one evaluates and separates life by way of what one does or doesn't want. The path of Praticca Samutpada offers something bolder and more enlivening. So peace could very well be linked up with this neurotic demand that I only want certain things and I don't want other things. This censorship that refuses to have, you could say, raw life. There's this fussy mentality that I just want certain things and not other things. And that, the more we indulge that, the more difficult our life becomes. The more we let go of that, the more we understand that the more we can free ourselves from that, the more we open up. So, speaking about Praticca Samutpada, Elizabeth says, Praticca Samutpada challenges you to let life touch you rather than live around it, to analyze the nature of things rather than shutting down around coarse ideas and dogmas. That's what we're doing here. Praticca Samutpada offers a path for being big enough for your life. See, life is going to happen, but it's a question of us resisting or trying to manipulate with this narrow sort of understanding of what's acceptable and not acceptable. You can let in all that life when you understand that things are not limited to the assumptions you have about them. This is where the teaching of Praticca Samutpada come in and challenge your notion of realness. And then coming back to then the initial point of departure of this work, which was Elizabeth talking about when her teacher then, he said, is this, what you see here, is this one or many? Yeah? Or, yeah, one or two. And she says, as I clearly see my teacher's gesture in my mind's eye, it reminds me that I am not one, nor am I two. We're not one because we're many different things. We're also not many because there is a sense of unity, etc. I am not the same, nor am I separate from the fathomless nature of interdependent expression. I am not in total command, yet everything I do matters. I am neither big nor small. I am, however, part of the great nature of infinite contingency, and in the moments I embody this wisdom, I live in grace. So we're not going to be without discomfort in our life. We're going to be encountering things that are deeply painful. We're going to be encountering things that are agreeable and so forth. But understanding this nature of the fact that things are contingent and do not possess any reality, we begin to embrace this reality rather than struggle against it. And so the moment that we embody this insight, we're living in grace. And I think from now on, I'm going to be reading it's just so good. So I was looking through this last section of the chapter, and I just thought it was too good. So I'm basically going to be reading the last section of this final chapter. So Elizabeth says, I wrote this book as a tribute to the experience of grace, the source from which all authentic faith traditions have emerged. But I also had something else in mind. I wanted to introduce the tradition of Praticca Samutpada into a bigger conversation regarding faith. I wanted to present an investigation that would liberate faith from the stagnant realm of individual and cultural beliefs and go beyond the vague assumption that remain locked up in language. I wanted to bring to the fore the practice of faithing or middle way as a protection from the extremes of eternalism and nihilism that run rampant in these times of extreme fundamentalism and doubt. There's just two things that I'd like to highlight. That is, first of all, the very common assumptions around the word faith and what it implies. That is very often seen, and actually we're introduced to it as meaning a way of limiting ourselves. And that's where this notion of belief comes in, where all of a sudden faith is equated with belief. And that stands opposed to doubt, obviously. Belief is setting oneself up for something crumbling down. And then again, with that, either of these, this sort of dichotomy is actually not innate to the nature of faith. And so I would say it's a very compassionate engagement from Elizabeth's side to actually engage in the bigger conversation. I have so much that same thought that we, if we're practitioners of the path, cannot exclude ourselves from the greater conversation that there exists. And so I would say, and I would find it very uncompassionate to not engage with others, not engage with the conversation that's being had around faith and also around fundamentalism and the traditional way that we just label then some of the faith traditions with either being eternalistic or nihilistic, which in fact is just a way that we diminish these, what she refers to as authentic faith traditions. So there's a place where the greater conversation and also the optics of modernity, they're just not big enough to actually understand some of these, understand reality, and as a result, then we have some very bigoted and narrow-minded proclamations about things like faith and about the misunderstanding around what comes from faith. And these are then where we have the projections of eternalism and nihilism. As I write the final chapter of this book, I continue to delight in the exploration of this single word, faith, and to the process of opening into inexhaustible universes rich with information and insight. I have used phrases and terms to point to the experience of faith, drawing on both personal examples and cultural narratives. Yet, as colorful, playful, and descriptive as these words may be, language always falls short of the liveliness of a direct experience. So, though it is said that all things must come to an end, I would have to disagree with this statement, and that lies in what we've been talking about here. Yeah? The moment that a book ends, well, we've just finished reading it, but our life goes on with the impact on that book, right? Elizabeth says, in fact, I believe it's an expression that's in need of some serious re-examination. Within the responsive nature of interdependent expression, everything influences every other thing, and that means that life will always be a work in progress. So although this book reaches its final pages, who can predict what will come from it? Writing it undoubtedly changed the way I see things. My hope is that it will keep you interested so that you will never shut down around words and experiences or fall into fundamentalism and doubt. To see the unconditional confidence, to see that unconditional confidence does not come from clinging to views. I thank you for joining me in rediscovering the word faith. It is my hope that you have discovered through the investigations presented in this book no need to abandon logic in order to faith. After all, given that the world doesn't lend itself to being known in a determinate way, faithing may very well be the only logical response to living in a world where everything leans. So on that note, then I hope we're taking this insight with us, the complete inseparability of these two, and the experience of grace. So when we look in the Buddhist teaching, it's not always that clear. And of course, Buddhist teachings have been presented within the last more than 2,000 years within Asian contexts, where the particular discourse then, as we come to it, sometimes is not that obvious. Mind you, I'd like to read one part which I came across it because a good friend of mine who passed away, and whose family I was very close with, he made a translation of this into French. His name was Robert Filiou, and I was very impressed with this book, or this work. It's called Verses on the Faith Mind. This comes from the Zen tradition. I think actually this resonates, I think, with many people. I'm not going to read all of it, and you have it up there in the reading folder, but I just want to read some of the verses of it here so we can read it together, but it's just such a delight. The great way is not difficult for those not attached to preferences. When not attached to love or hate, all is clear and undisguised. Separate by the smallest amount, however, and you are as far from it as heaven is from earth. If you wish to know the truth, then hold to no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When the fundamental nature of things is not recognized, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. The way is perfect as vast space is perfect, where nothing is lacking and nothing is in excess. Indeed, it is due to our grasping and rejecting that we do not know the true nature of things. Live neither in the entanglements of outer things, nor in ideas or feelings of emptiness. Be serene and at one with things, and erroneous views will disappear by themselves. When you try to stop activity to achieve quietude, your very efforts fill you with activity. As long as you remain attached to one extreme or another, you will never know oneness. Those who do not live in the single way cannot be free in either activity or quietude, in assertion or denial. So I'm going to leave it at this. So we have a little bit what we call the view, understanding this, and also the practice, which is this injunction to not take sides in terms of quietude or activity. If we're trying to just go off into the hills and remain serene, it'll just make us very, very busy. As actually one great Tibetan master, Shabgai, he says, the wish to stop all activity will just make us rush around. And so often you see people who want to go into retreat, they're very busy creating all the circumstances for that retreat. We often get very stressed. Anyway, the proposition here is to wherever we are, whether we're in activity or in quietude, to remain in this condition. Now, this is from the Zen tradition, and this is very much operates with an intuitive appreciation of this quality of grace. I'm going to bring in something from the Indo-Tibetan tradition, which operates more with an understanding of the scientific nature of, a bit like Elizabeth in those exercises we had in one of the first classes about settling down and analyzing. Because for us to see that things lean actually requires that we look. Like we could have this inspired thing of let's just remain in oneness, and if we get it, good. But we very often have that we intuitively appreciate oneness, but it's not something we then can draw on when the chips go down, when things get difficult. So we would say the Zen tradition is very much for those in the Mahayana tradition that have this ability to see the essence and stay with it, this immediate awakened quality. But we also have the other Mahayana traditions which operate with more a gradual approach, and which includes a scientific, if you like, or analytical approach. And that is what we've operated a lot with within the logic of faith. So we had the faith mind here, but now we're going to look a little bit at the logic part, which we in the modern world, I'm afraid, has romantically uncomplicated the sort of the Zen style sounds. Very often it ends up being a overlooking the critical or logical aspect of ourselves. Anyway, here I'm drawing from a sutra that you have in the 84,000 reading room, and this is a recent translation of a very important Mahayana sutra called the Rice Seedling, which is quoted quite a lot in the context of presenting the middle way. I'm presently going through it during Mondays in the study and practice session. But anyway, I just wanted to read something from here. So this is a discourse in which then the Buddha initially has, let me just read this actually, where the Buddha initially, he says something. He says, this is Shariputra, who's talking with his fellow Sangha person, the Bodhisattva Maitreya, and he says, Maitreya, listen here, this is Shariputra speaking. Today, the Bhagavan, gazing at a rice seedling, spoke this aphorism to the bhikkhus. Bhikkhus, whoever sees the pendant arising, sees the Dharma. Whoever sees the Dharma, sees the Buddha. Having said this, the Bhagavan fell silent. Maitreya, what is the meaning of this aphorism spoken by the Sugata? What is the pendant arising? What is the Dharma? What is the Buddha? How does one see the Dharma by seeing the pendant arising? How does one see the Buddha by seeing the Dharma? And then Maitreya gives a presentation of what this means. Basically that here when it says, well, the phrase dependent arising means that something arises because something else already exists. Something is born because something else already is born. Like the sprout comes from the existing seed. The plant of the sprout then comes from the sprout, and so forth, right? So in this way, he goes on to describe the 12 links of dependent arising. But at the end here, he says, why is it called dependent arising? It is called dependent arising because it is causal and conditional, not non-causal and non-conditional. In this connection, the Bhagavan concisely taught the characteristics of dependent arising as follows. Results comes from their own specific conditions. Whether Tathagatas appear, meaning whether Buddhas appear or not, this true nature of things will remain. It is the true nature, the constancy of Dharma, the immutability of Dharma, consistent with dependent arising suchness, unmistaking suchness, unchanging suchness, actuality, and truth, unmistaken and unerring. So while this fact that everything leans is something that the insight enables us to be free, where we could say this us understanding this nature frees us, but the nature itself is something that is not dependent on whether there's a Buddha teaching it or not. That's just the nature of reality. So that's a strong statement here, but also it follows then this particular logical way of formulation. And then lastly, I want to just then bring in a little bit about the way that then we establish what we call lack of self. And what we've been talking about here is this fact that whether it comes to ourselves and the other, it's something that is based on conditions, and that's also what the Buddha says here. So in here, Mirpam Rinpoche, who was a great sage, and also he actually blessed my teacher Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche when Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was very young, and he writes, based on the 5 skandhas of our personal identity, we have a consciousness that thinks I am. And this is the point that Elizabeth, she was making also. We solidify. And that is fixation on I. And the object is what we call self of person. That's where we begin to say I. So that we have, as long as we don't investigate and analyze it, we hold on to the notion of this self as something actually existing. In reality, it has no more existence than a snake mistakenly imputed on a striped rope. So when we misunderstand this rope and we don't have the conditions for seeing clearly, then we think, oh, there's a snake. But if we investigate, then actually there's no snake there. It's just conditions, leans. The basis for imputing this self, the 5 skandhas, are both multiple and impermanent. This is also what Elizabeth was saying. If we look at the self, it's not unitary, it's multiple, it's impermanent, it's changing. But the thing is, as Mirpam just says, yet we think of this self as permanent, as having come into the present from the past, continuing from the present into the future. While we think of the self as being singular, it is in fact merely imputed upon the assembled skandhas, without being ultimately established. The subjective conscious thought of I is fixation on a self, and the object of that grasping is then called the self. It becomes an absolute that rules us. Being merely imputed on the skandhas, then just like the striped rope, where there is no snake, there is no reality, no self. To know this is to know the view of selflessness of person. So that's about the perceiver. Now, external to the I or self are all other compounded or uncompounded phenomena, referred to as phenomena. These phenomena, seemingly existing when not investigated, are grasped as true and solid. And that is again where we don't see this conditioned nature. Yet, when investigated with reasoning such as the reasoning that negates singularity and plurality, like Elizabeth Sway is saying, is this one or two? It's actually neither. When we investigate in this way, both gross and subtle entities are discovered to be without foundation and root, and to be without any establishment. This is known as recognizing the selflessness of phenomena. Now, this is one of these classical texts where I would say, for anybody to come and encounter this, it would be very helpful to having first been through the exposure to the topic, the way that Elizabeth has done it. Very often when we come across these presentations, they very often can be confounding unless we're understanding this as presented from an immediate and intuitive experience of us in our life, where we can see that our person is something that is not unitary or solid, and also that we begin to understand that these realities that we perceive outside also lean. So this is where this study of the logic of faith is very, very helpful. At the same time, if we say, oh, I just want to have it formulated according to my culture, that's absolutely understandable. But at the same time, there is an incredible heritage of 2,000 years of Buddhism that we're then sort of, we miss out on. So hopefully, and also what I always doing when I'm presenting Dharma is very much that it's really with the intention to hook up with this living tradition that we've been talking about today. So we can go beyond some of the limitations we have from our culture and our language and begin to engage with that which is not necessarily immediately familiar. So, hey, I got a question. Wonderful. Can we say that the true nature is beyond systems, structures, and logic? Or because of one taste being the union of form and emptiness, then systems are imputed upon true nature? Yes, that's right. The not seeing that form and emptiness are inseparable, we attribute solidity to either being or non-being, and this is not what the nature itself is. And so the moment that we introduce to this wider perspective, then we are introduced to this dimension of grace, which lies beyond assertion and negation, is and isn't, and so forth. So this is where we go beyond the systems. But then again, good to have a system that can take us beyond the system, right? All right. Thank you for explaining the snake rope analogy. This is so useful. It's so useful. You know, it's when you have this snake that goes away because we look. It doesn't go away thanks to talking with the snake or somebody helping us. It's really just because we look. And that's also what is the red thread here. It's like we've been encouraged to continue this inquiry. And what she calls open inquiry, that we're willing to inquire. But it's not as if all of a sudden we become rope fanatics. There is only rope. It's about allowing to dispel. Basically, all we've done is dispel the notion of snake. The rope is kind of just there. But what really is helpful is that we've discovered for ourselves that there is no snake. It's not like somebody came and says, there is no snake. And they're like, okay, there's no snake. Okay, if you say so, there's no snake. It's about inquiry. All right. Well, I'd like to, along with Elizabeth here, thank you for joining in with this in this study. So this is then last session. The next online study that's going to be is in September. Actually, because of the visit of Khenpo Chögying Dorje, then this study started a little bit later than originally planned, so it's sort of a little bit back to back. But anyway, 12th of let me just go down here. 12th of September, then I'm starting this course, which is called Heart Treasure of the Enlightened Ones, which is then a beautiful, some verses from Paltru Rinpoche, a great sage, and it's about chanting the mantra, the Mani mantra, which is in Vajrayana, one of the key mantras. And again, this is about sustaining this open dimension, and it comes with Dinghu Chenzo Rinpoche's commentary. So while it is based on a Vajrayana practice of mantra, it is also a introduction to the entire Buddhist path, right from the foundations to the ultimate practices. So once again, I apologize for the slight confusion around the webinar earlier, but it seems that some of you made it. We have recorded it. It's in the box if you missed some of it. Anyway, thank you for being here. We shall dedicate the merit. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom.